My children thought my last legacy to them would be a pile of medical debt and a rambling, sentimental eulogy. They had no idea that my new hospital roommate, the grumpy old man in the bed next to mine, had just helped me turn my last will and testament into the most satisfying and most expensive lesson a mother could ever teach her children. Hi everyone. The channel calls me Grandma Eleanor. My name is Eleanor Ainsworth, and I am 78 years old. I'm speaking to you today from a place I never thought I would be, a place of unexpected peace and profound clarity. This is a story about a lie. A lie my husband and I told our children out of love, a lie they then used as an excuse to abandon me. It is a secret I've held in my heart for over a decade, the story of how my own children, believing me to be a penniless burden, left me to face major heart surgery all alone. I was ashamed to tell anyone, ashamed of their cruelty and, if I'm being honest, ashamed of my own gullibility. Before I share the details of this painful chapter, I would be so very grateful if you would please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is a powerful reminder that every person, no matter their age or circumstance, deserves to be seen and heard. It gives me the strength to finally tell a story I thought I would take to my grave. Thank you, my dears. Thank you for listening. My story, the real story, began not with this ending, but with a beautiful beginning. It all started with the life I built with my husband, David. Oh, David. He was my rock, my partner, my everything for 52 wonderful years. He was an architect, a brilliant man who didn't just build buildings. He built a life for us. A life of quiet success, of comfort, and of profound, unshakable love. We had a beautiful home, a sprawling historic house in Charleston that David had lovingly restored himself. It was our sanctuary, filled with books and art and the smell of the jasmine that grew up the porch columns. We raised 2 wonderful children within those walls, a son, Thomas, and a daughter, Amelia. They were our world, and for the longest time, we were theirs. Our life was idyllic. I don't use that word lightly. It truly was. We had family dinners every single night. We took trips to the coast in the summer. David taught Thomas how to build things, how to read a blueprint, how to be a good and honorable man. I would spend hours with Amelia in the garden, teaching her the names of all the flowers, or curled up in the big armchair in the library, reading her stories. We gave them everything: a top-notch education, unwavering support, and a foundation of love that we believed was indestructible. And because of David's success, we had money. We were not flashy people, but we were wealthy. And we worried about what that wealth might do to our children. We had seen so many of our friends' children grow up entitled, lazy, with no understanding of the value of a dollar or the satisfaction of a hard day's work. Then came the financial crash of 2008. We weren't ruined, not like some people. But we took a significant hit. And the event terrified David. It solidified a fear he had held for a long time, that the money, our safety net, could vanish overnight. And it gave him an idea that, at the time, seemed noble. A plan to protect our children from the disease of entitlement. One evening, he called a family meeting. Thomas was just starting his career in banking, and Amelia was in her last year of college. He sat them down in his study, his face grim and serious, and he told them a lie. He told them that the crash had been catastrophic for us, that the vast majority of our fortune was gone, wiped out. "The money is gone," he said, his voice full of a convincing, heartbreaking gravity. "I made some bad investments. I was too exposed. I'm so sorry. The house is paid for, and we have a small pension to live on, but the inheritance you were expecting, it's gone." It was a brilliant performance. He was a brilliant man. And he was, in a way, telling a version of the truth. He had lost a lot of money, but he had not lost everything. In fact, he had taken what was left, a very, very substantial fortune, and with the help of a team of clever lawyers, he had moved it into a series of complex, almost impenetrable offshore trusts. The money wasn't gone. It was just invisible, hidden away for a day far in the future. His plan, as he explained to me later, was to teach them a lesson, to force them to make their own way in the world, to build their own lives without the safety net of our wealth. He wanted them to learn resilience, to learn humility. "They'll be better people for it, Ellie," he'd said to me, his eyes full of a father's fierce, protective love. "When the time is right, when they've proven themselves, we'll tell them the truth. But for now, they need to believe they are on their own." And because I loved and trusted my husband, I went along with it. I played my part. We sold the second car. We stopped taking our trips to Europe. We began living a quiet, comfortable, but visibly frugal life. And our children, they believed us. They had no reason not to. The initial effect of David's plan seemed to be a good one. It lit a fire under them. Thomas, driven by a newfound fear of poverty, became a ferocious, ambitious banker, quickly climbing the corporate ladder. Amelia married well, to a man with his own money, and dedicated herself to a life of social climbing and maintaining appearances. They were successful. They were self-sufficient. David's plan, it seemed, had worked. He was so proud. But his plan had a side effect, a poisonous, unforeseen consequence that he never lived to see. David passed away 3 years ago. And with his passing, our children's narrative about the family shifted. Their father was no longer a brilliant man who had hit a patch of bad luck. He was the man who had lost their inheritance. And I was no longer the cherished mother living in the beautiful family home. I was the poor, widowed mother living in a big, expensive, and rapidly deteriorating house that was, in their eyes, the last remaining family asset. An asset that was costing me money I no longer had. An asset they were just waiting to liquidate. My loving children didn't see me anymore. They saw a line item on a budget, a problem to be managed. And I, still honoring my husband's dying wish to keep the secret of the trust until I felt the time was right, was about to find out just how much of a burden they truly considered me to be. After David's funeral, the change in my children was immediate and profound. The lie we had told them out of love became the lens through which they now saw their entire world, and especially me. Their sympathy for my grief was quickly overshadowed by their anxiety about my financial situation, or what I perceived to be my financial situation. The first front in their quiet war of attrition was the house. My beautiful Charleston home, the place David had poured his soul into, became a source of constant, low-grade nagging. "Mother, you can't possibly keep this place," Thomas would say, his voice full of a banker's brisk, unsentimental practicality. He'd visit for his obligatory Sunday dinner, and his eyes wouldn't see the memories. They'd scan the high ceilings and the grand winding staircase and just see a list of expenses. The property taxes alone are astronomical. The insurance, the upkeep, you're house poor, you're bleeding money. Amelia, my daughter, would take a different, softer, but no less damaging approach. "It's just so much for you to be alone in, Mom," she'd say, her voice dripping with a cloying, false concern. "All these rooms to clean, and the garden. You can't possibly manage it all yourself. You must be so lonely rattling around in this big old place." Lonely. It was a word she used a lot. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. They had decided I was lonely, and therefore I must be miserable. They never once asked me if I was happy. They never once seemed to notice the deep contentment I felt sitting in David's library, surrounded by our books, or the simple joy I took in tending to my roses. They didn't see my life, they saw a liability. I tried to push back, gently at first. "I'm perfectly fine, dear," I'd tell them. "I love this house. It's full of your father. It's where I feel closest to him." But my sentimental reasons were no match for their practical arguments. My love was dismissed as the foolish attachment of an old woman who didn't understand the realities of the world. "That's sweet, Mom, but feelings don't pay the bills," Thomas would say, his tone final. Their visits became less like social calls and more like financial audits. They stopped asking about my friends or the book I was reading. Instead, the conversations were always the same. Did you get the roof looked at? A new slate roof could cost $50,000, you know? Have you thought about downsizing? There's a lovely new retirement community just outside of town. It's very secure. Secure? That was their other favorite word. It sounded like they were concerned for my safety, but what I heard was that they wanted me contained. Put away. They wanted to sell the house, take the proceeds, their last tangible piece of inheritance, and put me in a small, manageable box where I would no longer be a financial or emotional burden. The second front of their campaign was against my health. It was a subtle, insidious form of gaslighting. I was in perfectly good health for a woman my age, but they began to treat me as if I were a fragile piece of porcelain, one step away from shattering. "Are you sure you should be eating that, Mom?" Amelia would say, eyeing the slice of cake at a birthday party. "All that sugar isn't good for your blood pressure. You seem a little tired today, Mother," Thomas would observe. "Are you getting enough rest? Maybe you should see the doctor." They were constantly monitoring me, looking for signs of weakness, for any evidence they could use to support their narrative that I was no longer capable of caring for myself. It was exhausting. I started to feel like I was living under a microscope. I began to doubt myself. Was I more tired than I thought? Was my heart fluttering a little more than it used to? Their constant suggestions of my own frailty began to feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then came the money. Or the lack of it. Honoring David's wish, I continued to live the lie. I lived frugally. I drove our old reliable car. I didn't buy new clothes. I was careful with my spending. And my children, instead of offering to help, simply took my performance as proof of my poverty. They never once offered financial assistance. Not a single time. Thomas, who worked at a high-powered investment bank and was certainly making a fortune, would complain to me about the cost of his children's private school. Amelia, whose husband was a successful surgeon, would lament the price of their recent kitchen renovation. They would talk about their financial burdens in front of me, their poor widowed mother, without a trace of irony. It wasn't that I needed their money. Gosh, I had more than they could ever imagine, tucked away in those silent, invisible trusts. But I needed the yofa. I needed the gesture. I needed to know that if I were truly in need, my children, the children I had poured my entire life into, would be there to catch me. But the offer never came. Instead, what came were suggestions on how I could cut back even more. "You know, Mom, you could probably save a lot on your heating bills if you just closed off the upstairs rooms," Thomas once suggested. He was telling his mother to live in a few rooms of her own home, like a tenant, to save a few dollars. Dollars he could have covered with what he probably spent on a single business lunch. The cruelty of it, the sheer, breathtaking selfishness, left me speechless. They weren't just neglectful, they were actively, consciously choosing to withhold their support, all while enjoying the fruits of the expensive educations and the stable upbringing David and I had provided for them. The slow, steady erosion of their love was more painful than any acute illness. It was a chronic ache in my soul. I missed my children. The real children, the ones who had loved me unconditionally, before their father's lie had infected them with a cold, transactional view of the world. I kept David's secret, but it was becoming a heavier and heavier burden. I would sit in his study at night, and I would talk to his portrait. "Oh, David," I'd whisper. "Your plan, it worked too well. It taught them to be self-sufficient, yes, but I think it also taught them to be selfish. It taught them to see me not as their mother, but as a bad investment." I was so lonely. But I was about to find out what true loneliness felt like. I was about to find out that when a real crisis hit, my children's concern, which was already so thin and transparent, would evaporate completely, leaving me utterly and completely on my own. The crisis, when it came, was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, violent thunderclap in the quiet afternoon of my life. I was in my garden, pruning the roses, when a pain unlike anything I had ever known seized my chest. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a crushing weight, a giant, invisible hand squeezing the very life out of me. My arm went numb. I couldn't breathe. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, what was happening. I was having a heart attack. I managed to stumble inside. My fingers, clumsy and trembling, fumbled with the phone. The last thing I remember is the calm professional voice of the 911 operator, and then nothing. I woke up in a hospital room. The world was a blur of white sheets, beeping machines, and the low, hushed murmur of nurses' voices. A kind-faced doctor stood by my bed. He explained what had happened. It was a massive heart attack, a widowmaker, he called it. I had been incredibly lucky. The paramedics had gotten to me just in time, but the damage was severe. I needed emergency bypass surgery. A triple bypass. The surgery was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. My first thought, after the initial wave of fear and confusion, was of my children, Thomas and Amelia. They needed to be here. I needed them. For the first time in my life, I was truly, desperately in need. A nurse helped me make the calls. I reached Thomas first. He was in a meeting. His voice was clipped, impatient. "Mom, what is it? I'm in the middle of something." My own voice was weak, a thready whisper. "Thomas, honey, I'm in the hospital. I had a heart attack." There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. "What? Are you okay?" "I need surgery," I whispered, the tears finally starting to fall. "A triple bypass. On Wednesday." Another pause. I could hear the muffled sounds of his office in the background, keyboards clicking, phones ringing. "My God, Mom," he said, and his voice was full of, "What?" Not concern. Not love. It was full of stress. The stress of an unexpected, inconvenient complication in his busy schedule. Okay. Look, I can't get away right now. I have a huge deal closing. Let me move some things around. I'll try to get there before the surgery, Kitri." He would egg tray to be there for his mother's emergency heart surgery. Then I called Amelia. She answered on the third ring, her voice a breezy hello. I could hear children laughing, the sounds of a party in the background. I told her the news. Her reaction was a mirror of her brother's. The initial shock, followed not by empathy, but by a litany of logistical problems. "Oh my God, Mom, a heart attack. But twins have their school play on Wednesday, and we have the fundraiser gala that night. I'm on the committee. I can't just not go. I need you, Amelia," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "I'm scared. I know," she said, her voice full of that same false, placating tone she had perfected over the years. "And of course, I want to be there. It's just, the timing is terrible. Let me see what I can do. I'll call you back." She didn't call back. Neither of them did. Not that day, not that night. The day before my surgery was the longest day of my life. I lay in that sterile white room, listening to the beeping of the machines, and I stared at the silent phone on my bedside table. I waited. I prayed. I made excuses for them. They're busy. They have their own lives. They'll come. Of course they'll come. Nada schön. But as the hours ticked by, a cold, hard, and unbearable truth began to settle in my soul. They weren't coming. And I knew why. They thought I was broke. They thought this surgery, this hospital stay, would be the final, catastrophic expense that would wipe out the last of my meager savings. They saw this not as a family crisis, but as a financial one. They were distancing themselves from the impending mountain of medical debt they were sure I was about to leave behind. My heart attack wasn't a tragedy to them. It was a liability. Their poor, widowed mother had become the ultimate bad investment, and they were cutting their losses. The grief of that realization was a pain far greater than anything in my chest. My heart had been broken by a blocked artery, but my soul was being shattered by the cold, calculating cruelty of my own children. The children I had loved, the children David and I had built our entire world around. Our great lie, our plan to teach them humility, had been a catastrophic failure. It hadn't just taught them to be self-sufficient. It had taught them that a person's worth is measured by their net worth, and in their eyes, My worth was now zero. That night, as I lay in the dark, waiting for the surgery that might kill me, I felt a loneliness so profound, so absolute, I thought it would swallow me whole. I was about to face the greatest trial of my life, and I was utterly and completely alone. The surgery was a success, in a medical sense. I survived. I woke up in the ICU, a tangle of tubes and wires, my chest a landscape of pain. But I was alive, and I was still alone. No flowers, no cards, no missed calls on my phone. After a day, they moved me to a regular room, a semi-private room, and that's when I met Arthur. My new roommate was a grumpy, cantankerous old man who was barked at the nurses and complained constantly about the food. He was a small, bird-like man, swallowed up by the big hospital bed. He had a permanent scowl etched on his face, and the most piercing, intelligent blue eyes I had ever seen. He was recovering from a nasty bout of pneumonia. We didn't speak for the first day. We just existed in our separate worlds of pain and discomfort, separated by a thin, beige curtain. But on the second day, a young, impeccably dressed lawyer arrived to see him. They spoke in low, hushed tones, but the curtain was thin, and I could hear snippets of their conversation. Words like mergers, acquisitions, hostile takeover. Later that afternoon, a nurse came in. "Mr. Blackwood," she said cheerfully, "your son is on the phone for you again." Arthur just scowled. "Tell him I'm sleeping," he grumbled. "And tell that daughter of mine if she sends one more ridiculously enormous bouquet of flowers, I'm going to have them sent to the morgue. At least someone there would appreciate them." The nurse just sighed and left. A few minutes of silence passed. "Your children?" I asked, my voice a weak croak. It was the first time I had spoken to him. He turned his head and glared at me from across the room. "My children," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "are vultures. They smell money and weakness. They circle. They're just waiting for me to die so they can pick the carcass clean." The bitterness in his voice was so profound, it resonated with the raw, aching wound in my own heart. For the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. "I know the feeling," I whispered. That one sentence opened a floodgate. For the next hour, we talked. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. He told me his story. He was Arthur Blackwood, as in Blackwood Industries, one of the largest and most successful private equity firms in the country. He was, by any measure, a billionaire. And his children were, in his words, trust fund-addled, Gucci-wearing disappointments. They never visited, they only called to ask about the stock market. Their only show of affection was a competition to see who could send the most ostentatious floral arrangement. "They don't love me," he said, staring at the ceiling. "They love the idea of me. They love my money. They've been waiting for me to die since they turned 21. Then he looked at me, his piercing blue eyes seeming to see right through me. "So what's your story, Eleanor? Where are the weeping children, the hand-wringing relatives?" And I told him everything. I told him about David, about our children, about the house. I told him about the great lie, the hidden trust, and the final crushing abandonment. I told him I was facing my own mortality, and the only thing I had to look forward to was a lonely house, and the knowledge that my children were just waiting for me to die, so they could sell it. He listened, his scowl never leaving his face. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." When I was finished, there was a long silence in the room, broken only by the steady beeping of my heart monitor. Then he said, "So, your children believe you are a penniless old woman with nothing but a house to your name?" "Yes," I said, my voice thick with tears. And in reality, he continued, a strange, dangerous glint in his eye, "You are an extraordinarily wealthy woman, with a vast, untouched fortune in a series of offshore trusts." "Yes," I whispered. He was silent for another moment. Then he pushed the button for the nurse. When she arrived, he barked, "Get my lawyer back in here, now, and bring him a pen." He then turned his head and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw him smile. It was a terrifying, brilliant, and utterly beautiful smile. It was the smile of a shark who has just found a fellow shark in a sea full of unsuspecting fish. "Eleanor," he said, his voice full of a gravelly, joyous glee. "Your children are about to get the lesson in finance that my children never had. We are going to rewrite your will, and it is going to be a masterpiece." Arthur Blackwood's lawyer, a young, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Peterson, looked as if he had been summoned to the principal's office. He stood nervously by Arthur's bed, clutching a leather briefcase. "Peterson," Arthur barked, without preamble. "Cancel my afternoon. We have a new client." He gestured a bony hand toward me. "This is Eleanor Ainsworth. Mrs. Ainsworth has a complex estate, a pair of deeply disappointing children, and a desire to make a significant philanthropic impact. We are going to restructure her last will and testament, and we are going to do it today." And just like that, my sterile, lonely hospital room was transformed into a high-powered law office. For the next 5 hours, I was no longer a sick, abandoned old woman. I was a client, a philanthropist, a woman of means and of purpose. Arthur was the general, and I was his willing field marshal. He was a ruthless, brilliant strategist, his mind as sharp as a scalpel. He grilled me for details, his piercing blue eyes missing nothing. He wanted to know everything about the trusts David had set up. He had Mr. Peterson on the phone with my family's old law firm in Charleston, demanding documents, barking codes and legal terms that I didn't understand. But I saw the look of dawning, shocked respect on the young lawyer's face as he began to comprehend the sheer scale of the penniless old woman's fortune. My children's great betrayal, their cold, calculating abandonment, had given me an incredible, unexpected gift: freedom. By treating me as if I were already dead, they had severed the bonds of maternal obligation. I no longer had to protect them. I no longer had to worry about their feelings. They had walked away from me. And in doing so, they had given me the absolute freedom to do whatever I wanted with the life and the fortune they had no idea existed. "So," Arthur said, a gleam of pure, joyful malice in his eyes, "the house. They believe the house is everything. Everything," I confirmed. "Excellent," he rasped. "Then the house is what we shall give them. It is the perfect Trojan horse." And so, we crafted the masterpiece. Under Arthur's guidance, and with Mr. Peterson's frantic scribbling, we drafted a new will. It was a work of art, a document of such precise and devastating revenge, that it was, in its own way, a thing of beauty. The first clause was simple. My beloved children, Thomas and Amelia, were to inherit the family home in Charleston, and all of its contents to be divided equally between them as they saw fit. But then came the second clause, the Trojan horse. The second clause stipulated that, as a condition of their inheritance, they were also to assume full and sole responsibility for a new charitable foundation established in my name, the Eleanor Ainsworth Foundation for the Care of the Elderly Abandoned. And the final clause, that was the masterstroke. The final clause dictated that the entirety of my hidden fortune, the vast multi-million-dollar trust that David and I had built, was to be the sole endowment of this new foundation. Every last penny. And my children, as the heads of the foundation, would be legally responsible for managing and dispersing these funds, but with one single, beautiful, and utterly crippling condition. They were forbidden from ever personally benefiting from, or drawing a salary from, the foundation's funds. Their work would be entirely unpaid. They would be the wardens of a vast fortune they could never ever touch. They would spend the rest of their lives managing my money, giving it away to the very people they had tried to emulate me becoming: the lonely, the abandoned, the elderly who were left behind by their own families. Their inheritance wasn't the money. Their inheritance was a lifetime of community service, a full-time, unpaid job administering the fortune they thought they had been cheated out of. The house, the asset they had coveted, would become the headquarters for this foundation, its upkeep and astronomical property taxes now their personal responsibility. It was a gilded cage. A beautiful, historic, and incredibly expensive prison of their own making. I signed the new will right there in my hospital bed, with Arthur and a very impressed Mr. Peterson as my witnesses. As I wrote my name, my hand was as steady as a rock. The weight of David's secret, the pain of my children's betrayal, it all just lifted. I had found a new purpose for my life, and for my money. It was no longer a secret to be kept, but a legacy to be built. I left the hospital a week later. My children were not there to pick me up. I took a taxi home to my quiet, empty house. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt purposeful. The call came from Amelia a few days after I got home. Her voice was a symphony of feigned concern and barely concealed annoyance. "Mom, we heard you were discharged. You should have called us. We would have been there. Would you have?" I asked, my voice calm and clear. There was a moment of silence. "Well, of course," she said, a little too quickly. "We've just been so worried and so busy. How are the bills?" "Ah, the bills. The reason for the call. The bills are all taken care of, dear," I said. "You don't need to worry about a thing." And I didn't speak to them again for a long time. I spent the next year recovering, getting stronger. And I spent it working with Arthur and his team, quietly and efficiently setting up the foundation. It gave me a new lease on life. Arthur, it turned out, was a wonderful friend. We would talk on the phone for hours, two grumpy old dragons, gleefully planning our philanthropic conquests. I lived for another 5 years after that day in the hospital. 5 wonderful, peaceful, and profoundly satisfying years. When I finally passed, peacefully in my own bed in my own beautiful home, I knew my work was done. I can only imagine the scene at the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I imagine my children, Thomas and Amelia, sitting there, their faces a mixture of feigned grief and greedy anticipation. I imagine the lawyer reading the first clause, and the looks of smug relief on their faces. "We got the house. It was all worth it." And then I imagine him reading the second clause. And the third. I imagine the slow, dawning horror as they comprehended what I had done. The realization that they hadn't inherited a fortune. They had inherited a life sentence of philanthropic servitude. They had received exactly what they deserved, the house they coveted, which was now their burden, and the money they craved, which they could now never touch. My lesson, the one I learned in that cold, lonely hospital room, is that family is not just about blood. It's about showing up. My children failed that test. But a grumpy, cantankerous stranger, a man who saw a kindred spirit in a lonely old woman, showed up for me. He gave me back my purpose. He helped me turn my greatest pain into my most powerful legacy. So, if you are out there, feeling alone, feeling abandoned, please do not despair. Sometimes, help and kindness come from the most unexpected of places. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give your children is not your inheritance. It's a lesson. A well-funded, legally binding, and unforgettable lesson in the true meaning of wealth. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being my unexpected friends. Please, before you go, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps build a community where no one feels alone. If you have ever found kindness in a stranger when you needed it most, please share your story in the comments. Let's fill the world with proof that decency still exists. Love you all. This is Grandma Eleanor, and I'll see you in the next story.